The line here. Yes. Who was I to be able to hinder God? That's what Peter is saying. Who was I to be able to hinder God? What's the concern about hindrance? Well, Peter has had a dramatic experience. This is in chapter 10 and 11 of the Acts of the Apostles. Today we get chapter 11 where he's explaining what happened. Chapter 10 is where it actually is happening to him, and he's trying to interpret these signs. And the signs are these. First, that these foods, and they don't automatically ring to us, but all the foods that were described there were foods that were considered unclean according to all the cleanliness laws that good, faithful Jews would have obeyed. Jesus would have obeyed these laws and not eaten anything unclean. And Peter and the apostles, also faithful Jews, would have been obedient to that. So the laws in themselves are not wrong. They're part of the fidelity to God. But God's going to change something here now with this new revelation of a new covenant that is in the blood of Christ. Okay, so it really is a game changer on so many levels, obviously. Not just to mention resurrection from the dead, conquering death, eternal salvation, all that. But it's also going to have impact on a lot of other practical matters of the faith and what it means to be faithful. Because the other piece is then the faith is no longer limited to just the Jewish people, but also the Gentiles. Now we could sit there and go, well, what's their problem? They just need to be nicer to other people who are not Jewish. We've learned a long time ago and are still actually working at it. But everybody, all human beings are welcomed into the faith, and there shouldn't be a distinction between Jew and Gentile. It seems like an archaic issue now. But you have to remember, who were the Gentiles? They were those who worshiped the emperor, at least the Roman Gentiles that they were running into all the time, who worshiped the emperor, made a human being as a god, and worshiped gods that were not the God of Israel. So violation of the first commandment. So that makes them unclean. They've got their weird religion. They would have said. Also, they were physically oppressing them. They had conquered their nation and were exacting taxes from the people of Israel that were going to this conquering nation back to Rome. So that was another thing. Plus, they had practices that just seemed unclean and uncouth, and a whole different moral framework that just looked like absolute moral decay. So they really had a lot of reasons to see and judge, make actually fair judgments about the uncouth ways, non-faithful religious ways of the Gentiles. So there were a lot of reasons why they didn't care for them. Those are the common sense reasons. Then there's all the prejudicial reasons that also come in, that are completely unfair and irrational, but are culturally based. So they had, just at their gut, they would have felt and been able to argue it, that we shouldn't have anything to do with those people. We shouldn't form relationships, shouldn't intermarry. They were not good people. That was the impression everyone would have had. So for Peter to have this vision, and it's not just to eat foods that were previously understood as unclean, that alone is cataclysmic, but it's also saying that these Gentiles, because right then, God had orchestrated this. It's amazing to see how it works. Because at Caesarea, Cornelius had this experience, and he sent people to collect Peter because God ordered him, go bring this person named Peter and have him preach to you. And he's going to hear the saving words of Jesus Christ. So that as Peter has this vision, by that time, these people had journeyed. So they knocked on the door as soon as Peter had completed experiencing the vision. And so he was open to these new foods and now open to Gentile people. And then follows, and conversions take place. The Holy Spirit comes upon them. And he takes 8 brothers with him, so other disciples are with him. So there were many witnesses at the power of the Holy Spirit on the lives of these Gentiles and their genuine conversion. And Cornelius had gathered a whole household of people. It must have been a cataclysmic, profound event. So, and so important that Luke reports it not just at the moment, and then Peter describing it. So again, to lock in this notion. And this is going to be the debate about the mission to the Gentiles in the subsequent chapters here. And then Paul is going to be engaged in that. We're going to see that pretty much through the end of the Acts of the Apostles. It's a big deal. And then Paul's conversion, it's another example of where we hear the story of the conversion and then the retelling of the story. So that says something about these are cataclysmic and key events, so we need to pay attention. It calls them for openness of mind. Here's one thing I'd like to take away. And by the way, the gospel also refers to it, the good shepherd. He says, there are other sheep. I almost flubbed that line when I read it. I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. These also I must lead, and they will hear my voice. Here's a prophecy that at the time the apostles didn't know what he was talking about. But that's a reference to the mission to the Gentiles, the other sheep, the rest of the world, not just the people of Israel, but to all humanity. So, okay. Now, what's one thing that we can draw from this? Not only the expansiveness of God's plan, but also notice a consistency when we're called to discern things in our lives. It seemed like a big shift for us. Wow, is this really from God? Is this just my opinion? How do I test this? And there's a lot. St. Ignatius wrote a lot about discernment of spirits and discernment like that. But here's one of the ways. Notice the consistency. God spoke to Cornelius. He sent people to Peter. Peter has this experience. God is speaking to him. Those experiences match and intersect. Peter takes witnesses with him. They observe it as well. And they see what's happening, and he's telling the story. And they're convinced this must be God's plan. And then when they explain it to the others, they explain it to their satisfaction. At first they were saying, we heard you've been talking and bringing Gentiles into the faith. I mean, because those visceral reactions I mentioned earlier, they would have reacted. So they listen to Peter and see the consistency in all those pieces coming together, God's plan working in this moment to make a big point. And the consistency speaks to them. See, there is a certain logic about God's plan. There is a consistency in the pattern. And that's how revelation works for the sake of our human understanding with our frailness as humanity, as human beings. God makes it clear in numerous ways. And all of this is consistent then with the message of Jesus and his message and statement here. It all ties together as part of God's plan. So when we're discerning something, we say, well, okay, is what I'm thinking, is it consistent with the scriptures? Is it consistent with the tradition of our church from which the scriptures came forth? The lived experience and written down and told these testimonies. Is it consistent with practices I see around the church? Do I seek counsel from others who are part of the faith? Is it consistent there? When we see all those things coming together consistently, then we can say, maybe this is God's plan in my life. So that consistency is very important because it's the way God works in Revelation, and it's the way that God works in our lives today. Be open to the Spirit. And what made the difference isn't just that God was messaging these things, but the docility of his hearers. We're called to be docile, to be open to God's movement. Yet check it out, test it out, and it should come through consistently, but be open to the movement of the Spirit in your life.